Cole Porter's Night and Day was the #1 hit song in the United States in 1933. For half the country, every night and every day was a living hell. 1 in 4 workers was unemployed. Financial institutions had cratered. There was no such thing as Social Security. It was the Great Depression. Just 1 year before, many of the veterans of military service during the First World War had marched on Washington. They camped on public grounds and demanded that their promised war bonuses be paid early. Herbert Hoover's Washington was having none of that. A combination of police, tanks, and bayonet-wielding soldiers had rooted out the bonus marchers. But a new hope had arisen. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the new president of the United States, and he promised the tortured country a New Deal. Happy days, the Democrats assured the country, were here again. And for a growing number of Americans, they were. Women's baseball was a growing thing in sport. The Indianapolis 500 motor race was held. The football teams of the military academies of West Point and Annapolis played in the annual Army-Navy game. But one other less than happy thing happened that year. Way down south, in the jungles of Panama, Technical Sergeant Gregorio Adan Diaz was being held for ransom by a fiercely independent faction of native people. They were known to foreigners as the San Blas Indians, but they called themselves the Kuna people. Initially, the Kuna people had friendly encounters with the Spanish conquistadors, but the brutality of the Spaniards soon put them off. The Kuna withdrew and became one of the few examples of native people who have successfully resisted conquest and forced assimilation. They did not allow foreigners to stay anywhere in their lands after nightfall. Worry about the future of the Panama Canal brought my father and the Kuna people together. The construction of the Panama Canal benefited the United States in 2 major ways. The first was obviously economic. The coast-to-coast transportation of goods by sea became faster and easier than before the canal. The second benefit was strategic and military. The United States Navy now had a way to connect its fleets between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The storm clouds of war were already gathering in 1933, and new technology was changing the nature of war itself. A renegade Army general named Billy Mitchell had proven that naval warships were vulnerable to sinking by Air Force bombers. Many of the nation's military leaders were agitating for rearmament. Some of them were especially concerned about the vulnerability of the Panama Canal.
It does seem amazing that civilized nations should continue to adhere to war as an element of national policy. Even now, less than a score of years after the World War, armies and armaments are being rapidly multiplied until in many countries the burden seems wholly unbearable. It is almost axiomatic to say that a people who complacently submit to unreasonable demands of a clamorous minority will certainly become the prey of a dictator. This nation, as one of the great powers, can do no less in the fulfillment of its manifest duty to humanity than to make the most earnest and devoted effort for the preservation of world peace. On the efficacy of these plans will someday rest the life of the nation. On the War Department rests the responsibility for their preparation.
Strategic planners were looking for other routes across Panama. To that end, soldiers of the Army's 11th Engineers stationed in Panama were assigned to what was called trail reconnaissance. Trail reconnaissance was a difficult task. As one soldier wrote in his memoirs, quote, "Trail reconnaissances are experiences that try the souls of men, and incidentally, their vocabularies also. Who can forget the first one?" End quote. Sergeant Gregorio Adan Diaz was a member of the 11th Engineers Band in Panama. The band performed the usual musical duties. Here they are, playing for a review in honor of a visiting French marshal. However, members were also assigned to or volunteered for collateral duties. Sergeant Diaz volunteered for a trail reconnaissance. He would be the senior member of a trio of 3 soldiers. The team were flown from the Pacific coast of Panama to the San Blas Islands on the Atlantic or Caribbean side. Their mission was to search for a reported trail from Margana on the San Blas coast to the village of El Llano on the other side of the Jungle Mountains. It is hard to exaggerate the fierce jungle and difficult mountain heights that lay between those points. Passage was virtually impossible without an experienced guide. Throughout history, those who had tried on their own disappeared forever in the darkness of the jungle. Sergeant Diaz and his team employed a guide from among the San Blas Indians, and the team began its trek into the jungle. But on the morning of the second day, the soldiers awoke and found that their guide had disappeared. One supposes that they could have simply turned around and gone back. But I know my father well enough to know that, as the senior member of the team, he must have insisted that they continue with their mission, guide or no guide. There was no trail. These 3 soldiers hacked, scrambled, crawled, and walked their way through the jungle and over the mountains. They had to endure the annoyances and dangers of the tropical jungle. Among these were ubiquitous ants, biting and stinging insects, a variety of poisonous snakes, crocodiles, and other dangerous animals. The unforgettable noise of howler monkeys haunted their nights. These 3 soldiers must have felt enormous relief when they got over the mountain and finally saw a native village on the other side. The inhabitants of this village were a branch of the Kuna people known as the Pintupo. The Pintupo offered these soldiers a curious form of greeting. They took the soldiers captive and sent a message downriver to the United States Army. "If you want your people back," they said, "send a case of whiskey upriver and we will let your people go." The Army sent the case of whiskey up the river, and my father and the 2 other soldiers floated down the river by canoe. I know this story sounds incredible. I questioned it myself until I found a commendation that my father and the other 2 soldiers received on January 24th, 1934, from the headquarters of the 11th Engineers in Panama for excellent work in their special reconnaissance. Quote, "Despite great hardships and the fact that they were held prisoners by the Pintupo Indians, they reached El Llano, bringing valuable information of trails, rivers, and people in the part of Panama they had traversed." End quote. I call it Indiana Diaz's excellent Panama adventure. In the next episode of Fire and Ice, we will return to Seattle, where my father made the promises and assumed the duties of marriage and of citizenship. He had his fingers crossed on one of those occasions.